Journey is one component of the African American Leadership Initiative designed to provide intentional leadership training and education to individuals. Journey is accompanied by AALI Social, a monthly networking event, and AALI Speaks, a monthly speaker presentation, all in an effort to engage and further develop African Americans in Mansfield and Richland County. As always, we would like to thank and recognize our sponsors, the Richland County Foundation and First Energy, for their continued support of the AALI program. Our webinar today is presented by Renee Thompson, founder and CEO of Unlimited Potential for Achievement. Renee.
Thank you so much, Leona. As one of the managing partners of Unlimited Potential for Achievement, I know that's a mouthful, so we also call ourselves UPA. I know that we are committed to the work of organizations such as NECIC. Our mission is to unleash the hidden and unique capacities for achievement that are embedded within today's diverse workforce to enhance the probability of both personal success as well as increased organizational profitability. Having conversations regarding leadership development are particularly important within business as well as within our communities. So today's session is focused upon the influence of implicit biases and values upon leadership. I am so pleased to be able to have Dr. Phil Mazzocco as today's guest. Dr. Phil Mazzocco is an associate professor at The Ohio State University right here in Mansfield. He received an ABA in psychology from OSU and later on his PhD in social psychology as well from OSU. He then completed a one-year postdoctoral research fellowship at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Starting in the fall of 2006, he began working at OSU Mansfield. Dr. Mazzocco's research focuses on the factors that underlie racial attitudes and especially racial policy attitudes. He's also interested in the conditions under which fairness motives will overwhelm self-interest motives and vice versa. His research has appeared in academic journals, edited book chapters, and in numerous academic conferences. So in terms of today's program, Phil will open up the discussion by helping us to understand just what implicit bias is. And then we will continue on to the interview segment where Phil and I will discuss more of how our biases impact us in the workplace and in other aspects of our lives. So without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Phil Mazzocco.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I want to thank the African American Leadership Initiative at NECIC and the organizers, Leon, Edward, and Renee, for hosting this. Today, I'm going to start out with a roughly 30-minute presentation. Again, the title of the talk is The Influence of Implicit Biases and Values on Leadership Styles. And we will get to leadership, but before we do that, I want to try to provide a really firm foundation regarding the nature of implicit bias and the science of implicit bias, because I think that it makes it a lot easier to explain just how pervasive implicit bias is in any human context, but especially in terms of leadership. So I've structured the talk around 5 questions. Each of these is a different section of the presentation. First, we'll try to answer the question, so what is implicit bias? This is a term I think that is thrown around commonly and different people define it in different ways. I'm a social psychologist and my background, as Renee referred to, is in the realm of racial attitudes and racial phenomena. So as a scientist, we define implicit bias very specifically. I'll try to give some background on that definition. And then we'll talk about how implicit bias originates. One of the claims that I'll make that is backed by science is that we all have implicit bias. Depends on the category and the nature of that bias, whether it be positive or negative, also varies from person to person. But we all have bias, so where does it come from? In the third section, we'll talk about how you yourself can assess your own implicit bias. Unfortunately, you can't just scan your brain consciously and introspect and detect implicit bias. You actually need some generally cognitive tests, which will uncover that bias for you based on a task you're performing, or a series of judgments you make. So we'll talk about that. In the fourth section, we'll talk about how implicit bias may impact leadership, probably does impact leadership. And then finally, in the fifth section, we'll sort of talk about what can you do to overcome your implicit bias, to reduce implicit bias, or at least to try to maintain awareness of it and question yourself regarding your judgments, your decisions, your treatment of others. So we'll start with this first question of what is implicit bias? So to give even among social psychologists, if you ask 50 different social psychologists, you might get 50 slightly different definitions. I've tried to distill all those definitions into just a short 4-word description. Implicit bias is a series of subconscious expectations and evaluations. So when I use the word expectation, that's probably what you think of as stereotypes. Stereotypes are traits, characteristics, tendencies that we assign to categories of people. And they are expectations that we have if we've never met this individual before. We can consult our stereotypes to take some educated guesses, perhaps, about who we're dealing with, what they're like, what their values are, and so on. And in some cases, these stereotypes can be positive. In some cases, they can be negative. In some cases, they may be mixed. You might have a whole series of positive and negative stereotypes about a given individual. And also importantly, you might be aware of stereotypes that exist and not endorse them personally. You might say, well, I know what people say about category X, even though I don't personally believe that to be true. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And we'll actually get back to that as we delve into implicit bias. With evaluations, I'm talking about prejudice, emotional reactions, the tendency to label categories of people as good or bad, safe or dangerous, industrious or lazy, where there's going to be some corresponding emotional reaction, which could be hatred, it could be disgust, it could be fear, it could be resentment, bitterness, and again, it could also be positive. For example, the kinds of emotions that your own groups might elicit, trust and safety and happiness and so on. The other important word there is subconscious. So I'm going to delve into that next. So implicit and explicit bias, it's important to differentiate these. When you think about your bias and you introspect and you ask yourself, okay, how do I feel about a given group? You're thinking at the level of explicit bias. So this is your conscious bias, you're aware of it, it's verbalizable. I can describe my feelings, my evaluations, the associations I make towards other groups verbally. And whether I decide to express these biases or not in a given setting, it's voluntary, it's a controlled process. A thought might enter my mind in a given context about a given group, and I might decide I'm not going to express that because it would be rude or because it would put my reputation in jeopardy. So it's controlled, and this is the kind of bias that we have personal experience with and are familiar with because it's conscious. We can detect it. Implicit bias is subconscious. So it's operating sort of beneath the conscious layer of your mind, buried in your subconscious. So this is very similar to Freud's perspective of the way that the mind worked. There was this conscious level, but also a subconscious level. And within this subconscious level, associations, evaluations, emotional reactions to groups can reside completely without our knowledge. And we'll talk about in a few minutes how that can be the case. How could there be something in your mind that you're not aware of that you can't detect? But with an implicit bias, there can still be a reaction, a judgment, a behavior based on the bias that is going to be automatic and involuntary, meaning you can't control it. And that's what makes implicit bias so dangerous, is that you can act in accordance with these biases beyond your control. And you might not even know, it might be so subtle that you might not even know you're being influenced by an implicit bias. Also, implicit biases are not verbalizable. You can think of implicit biases almost like wires that connect different concepts in your head that might connect a given group with good or safe or negative or hateful, violent, again, stereotypes or evaluations. And that wiring, those associations are buried within your subconscious. You cannot detect them or verbalize them. And in that respect, you can't be consciously aware of them or think about them. So a couple of basic principles that scientists have discovered and that we all basically agree on regarding implicit bias. The first, as I've already referred to, we all have implicit biases. Now, there may be a tendency to think of dominant social categories, race, gender, ethnicity, age, and so on. But if you think about it, there are thousands of social categories that exist that relate to personality types, social roles, physical attractiveness, vocational backgrounds. There are thousands of ways to categorize any given individual, and then you can multiply that by the 7 billion people on this planet. So you might think to yourself, I believe I do not have an implicit bias relating to race. That doesn't mean you don't have an implicit bias relating to hundreds or thousands of other categories. Also, once again, it's not the kind of thing where you could just introspect and make a confident statement that I don't have an implicit bias. So if you're sitting there thinking, I don't think I'm the kind of person that would have an implicit bias, that's not the kind of judgment that we're capable of making as humans. You cannot really shine a flashlight into your subconsciousness and see what's lurking in there. Secondly, we know that implicit biases tend to service the self. They are related to our self-esteem, and our self-esteem is linked to the groups to which we belong, as I refer to as in-groups. So a lot of implicit biases are going to be biased in favor of our in-groups, and as opposed to our out-groups. So when you think about negative prejudice, negative stereotypes, it's more likely that you will find those associations with out-groups. With in-groups, it's more likely that you will associate positive stereotypes, positive emotions, positive prejudice. And that's going to actually provide some clues regarding why implicit biases are so pervasive and in some cases are hard to unlearn. Third, and this is really important, and I've been talking in and around this issue, implicit and explicit biases often differ. So you might very sincerely indicate that you have no prejudice regarding Hispanics. And that might be a sincere statement. Nevertheless, you may have negative associations that are implicit and subconscious that relate to ethnicity. Both of those things can be true. And when we talk about some of these self-assessment tools that you can use to try to shed light on your own implicit biases, we'll talk about how it's very common to have different sets of explicit and implicit biases, or no explicit bias, but some implicit bias. Finally, we know that implicit biases are malleable. There's no evidence that you were born with implicit bias, but there is evidence that at a very young age, we acquire implicit biases, and we'll talk about some of the processes by which that occurs. But accordingly, later in life, when you become aware of these biases, there are steps that you can take to actually change them, to, so to speak, rewire the connections in your head to reduce, diminish, or even obliterate these biases. All right, so that moves us into the second section of the presentation. How does implicit bias originate? And here, the analogy that you can use is to imagine that the human brain is like a sponge, and it soaks up stimuli. It soaks up associations that exist in the dominant culture, associations that are common in the home during early childhood, associations once the child goes out into the world that you find in school, maybe among the older kids on the playground, certainly within media. So primarily, when we think about implicit bias and where are the origins of most implicit bias, we think about exposure. It's not that prejudiced people have implicit bias, although there is a link between prejudice and implicit bias that I'll talk about in a moment. But primarily it's exposure. It's advertisements. And again, by the time you're 18, you will have seen perhaps 100,000 advertisements. Each of these ads is laden with cultural associations. It could be conversations, especially with role models like parents or teachers, older siblings, friends. It could be jokes that are told, and the jokes contain certain associations that relate to stereotypes or prejudice regarding certain groups. It could be news media, crime reporting, the way that political topics are covered. This is some examples, and certainly entertainment media, television shows and movies and magazines and comic books and YouTube and Instagram and so on. All of these are laden with these associations that are linked to stereotypes and prejudice and expectations about other groups. And I'll show you an example in a moment, but I did want to mention that certainly if you do have an explicit prejudice and you spend a lot of time thinking about it and sort of practicing these associations in your head, that also will build an implicit bias in your head that is consistent with your prejudice. But the key point here is that that's not necessary. Just mere exposure to culture is sufficient to write implicit bias into your subconscious mind. So next I'm going to show a 30-second ad. This is from a 2010 Super Bowl commercial, and we'll just let that ad play.
Mike, what is your deal, man?
Come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby.
Whoa.
Eat a Snickers. Better?
That hurt. You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
All right, so there's an ad. This, again, could be one of hundreds of thousands of ads that you see throughout the lifespan. And it seems harmless. It's, a joke. Betty White, she's funny. It's meant to just be a simple laugh line and ideally to sell you Snickers. But imagine that you're a 5-year-old kid who's watching the Super Bowl with your parents, male or female, and you're trying to understand what's going on in this ad. Why is this ad funny? So here are some associations that may occur to your subconscious mind. One, who's playing the sport? It's all men, primarily young men, primarily white men. And who is the sort of punchline, the opposite of the man playing the sport? It is Betty White, a woman and an older individual. The other place you see women in the ad is sitting on the sidelines rooting for the men. So if you're a small child trying to figure out where is my place in this ad, and you're a boy, you say, oh, I'm out there, I'm part of the action, I'm playing the sport, it's exciting. If I'm a girl, I may be thinking, oh, I am either supposed to be on the sidelines cheering, or maybe I'm there, but I'm not supposed to be there like Betty White. So there are cues about gender, certainly. There are cues about age and the elderly. The other sort of punchline is Abe Vigoda, who shows up at the end, another elderly person, in this case a male, but still making the point that elderly people should not be doing activities like this, or at least we wouldn't expect it. So those are some of the dominant themes that you could pick up from that ad. Also, the men are dirty, they're scruffy, probably some hidden messages there about what it means to be a real man, a down-to-earth man, literally getting down in the earth, getting dirty. So there's a 5-year-old who is capable of acquiring all of those associations from a single exposure to one advertisement. And your subconscious does not require you to be paying close attention to this ad, nor to be thinking about it explicitly. The job of the subconscious is to soak up these associations like a sponge. It's going to happen whether you desire it to or not, especially when you're young, because that is the job of the young, is to learn culture, to wire their brain with all relevant cultural associations. Though I do want to say, this continues happening throughout your lifespan. We continue to be exposed to advertisements and media, conversations, news stories, and we're continuing to either acquire new associations or we're having our already existing associations maintained and strengthened. So this is sort of just one example of how we can acquire associations. And next time you're watching commercials or watching a TV show or a YouTube clip, think about how many social associations have been presented to you that you are soaking up in a sort of passive, mindless way, but nevertheless are affecting your level of implicit bias. Okay, so that gets us to the third section. How can you assess your own implicit bias? And as I've said, you can't just look into your brain explicitly and consciously and detect bias. It's buried within the subconscious mind. And you can reflect. We just watched an ad. It's clear from that ad the kinds of associations that your mind probably acquired and noticed. So you can think about society, you can think about art, entertainment, news, conversation, politics, religion in a sort of sober and critical fashion, and think about what kinds of associations am I being exposed to commonly? What are some of the dominant themes within culture? There's a better than average chance that those themes are reflected in my head. I couldn't say for sure, no one could say for sure, but if you're taking a guess, you can guess what kinds of associations are likely to be represented in your head. But more importantly, and why I've underlined this, is that there exist tests that allow you to assess your implicit bias in a much more valid and certain way. There are a range of these tests, and you can go online and find these. The most popular one, the most commonly used test, and this is one that has been studied across tens of thousands of scientific papers, is Harvard's Project Implicit. Provided the web link down below there, and I would really encourage everyone to put that link into a browser, go to the social attitudes section and take some of these tests. If you do, you will be confronted with a very simple task. It's a grouping task where you will see a stimuli and you'll be asked to categorize it in one category or another. And the ease or difficulty of this task will reveal implicit biases. There are tests that are specific to gender bias, racial bias, age bias, religion, disability, gender roles in the workplace, even presently, and I just checked this a couple days ago, biases that relate to a particular president, who is our president at the moment. You can see if you have an implicit bias regarding our president. There's lots of tests, they change occasionally. The categories that I have on the slide here are ones that are always available. But you can go and take these tests. Any given test will take 4 or 5 minutes, and you will get a readout assessing your level of implicit bias, whether there's a bias at all, what direction the bias is in, positive or negative, what kinds of associations are being have been measured within your head. And you will also get some information regarding how common your bias is. Is this something that's happening 5% of the population, 20% of the population, and so on? So you will have some context with which to understand the bias that's uncovered. I do want to remind you that if you find that you have a bias, this might surprise you, this might disappoint you, but it's very common. Most people, for example, who take the race test have an implicit racial bias. Most whites who take this test have a pro-white bias. People who are Black who take this test tend to have a pro-Black bias. It's rare that an individual would have no bias whatsoever. And you shouldn't necessarily jump to the conclusion that if you or someone else, say, has a pro-white bias, that means you're a racist in the traditional sense. It may just mean that you have been exposed to pro-white associations throughout your upbringing and, again, even leading up to the present day. In fact, that's primarily what the evidence suggests, is that these implicit biases, again, do reflect exposure much more than prejudice. So again, I encourage you to go and take these tests and actually just find out. You can be certain and confident about your bias across a wide range of social categories. I do want to, I've already talked about some of these disclaimers. Once again, the idea that implicit biases do not necessarily equate with explicit biases. The fact that they do tend to associate with exposure. And I also just want to mention that the science indicates that these tests are not 100% reliable. Nothing in science is 100% reliable. And so I would encourage you to take these results with a small grain of salt, but even better, take them twice. You might have a slight error in your results once. It's unlikely to replicate a second time you take this test. All right, so into the fourth section now, we'll get into leadership and values. This slide with a flow chart here, I just want to indicate that implicit bias affects every level of human response, from perception to thinking to emotion to evaluation to impression. So these are mental constructs, but then those filter out into real world decisions and real world behaviors. Implicit bias is designed to help you navigate the world, to help you come up with clear thoughts and clear decisions and make certain behaviors. It's a filter through which you see the world. And in some cases, implicit biases, if we think outside of the realm of social categories, we have implicit associations that relate to just everyday objects, what you do when you walk into a restaurant, what you do when you're approached by an animal who looks frightened. We have these built-in implicit automatic responses that are going to generally be adaptive and help us navigate throughout the world. They're going to help us to rely on previous experiences and prior learning experiences so that we don't have to continue having novel experiences and making mistakes and putting ourselves in harm's way. But in the realm of social interaction, every person we interact with is new. They are all individuals. They are all unique and separate. And so it's not necessarily an adaptive strategy to rely on these general implicit associations we have when we are trying to think about or understand or interact with another individual. But it is happening. It is automatic. It is uncontrollable. If you have the implicit bias, we know it's going to leak out into your mindset and interactions. So what I want to do, there's a large body of science on this. I just want to show you, walk you through one study that demonstrates this point and demonstrates another point that I want to make. So in this study, and Jack Davidio is one of the most distinguished researchers within the realm of stereotyping and implicit bias. But in this study, the participants were white college students. And prior to interacting with a Black person in the study, they were measured both in terms of explicit and implicit racial bias, in particular prejudice. As I've said before, in many cases, these two types of bias differ. You could have no explicit prejudice whatsoever, but have a high level of anti-Black implicit prejudice. You have all different combinations. So we have this information, they had this information for all of their participants. And then they had these individuals interact with a Black person who was sort of in on the study. It was a structured interaction, but it was a real interaction, even though it took place within a lab. They had some conversations. During this interaction, the verbal and nonverbal behaviors of the white participants were being measured surreptitiously through a hidden camera. So you could certainly write down and record the things that these white participants were saying, the actual content of the conversations, the friendliness of the words that were being used. But at the same time, another set of individuals were coding the nonverbal behaviors, the level of eye contact, the posture, the body language. And again, all of these could be coded in terms of the warmth and the friendliness and the openness. So all of this was being recorded. After the interaction, white participants or the subjects rated how friendly they thought they had been during the interaction. And the Black Confederates, the interaction partners, also rated the white participants on this very same dimension. Okay, so on the next slide are the findings. So which one that won out here, the explicit or the implicit prejudice? It turns out they both had an impact, but just on different types of responses. The explicit prejudice predicted the verbal friendliness of white participants and also how the white participant thought the interaction went. So if you have a low level of explicit prejudice as a white participant, you might have said, I think I was pretty friendly actually, and that went pretty well. I think we got on pretty well. Now, at the same time, if you have a high level of explicit prejudice, you might have said, honestly, I probably wasn't that friendly, and they probably picked up on that, and I don't think it went very well. So that's explicit prejudice. Implicit prejudice, on the other hand, predicted nonverbal friendliness or unfriendliness. So it predicted body language and how far away you sat from the individual, how much eye contact there was. And it's, as you would expect, if you had a higher level of implicit prejudice, there was less friendly body language, less eye contact, you were sitting farther away from the individual. Importantly, the implicit prejudice predicted the Black Confederates' perception of the interaction. So what can happen here if you have a low level of explicit prejudice but a high level of implicit prejudice, which is very common, is you can walk away from the interaction as a white person saying, I think that went really well. I was friendly. I didn't see any problems with that interaction. And your interaction partner can walk away thinking they don't like Black people. And they didn't say it, they were saying all the right things, but their body language completely gave them away. The key here is that our body language when we're having a conversation is usually on autopilot. We're not thinking about it, we're not trying to control it, and that's where implicit attitudes and associations come to the fore. That's what they're there for. They'll handle the autopilot. And if they realize I have a negative association towards this person, yes, I will not make friendly eye contact. My body language will be more closed off and unfriendly. And you won't know you're doing that consciously. You will think you're saying all the right things. So this is just one example of how an implicit bias can enter into a very specific conversation you're having with someone from a different group. Now, if we think about leadership in the real world, people who are in positions of leaderships, and you can think about within an organization, they interact with people both in person and in terms of evaluations and decisions, the things that are on the list here, from reviewing a resume before you've even met this person to deciding to bring them in for an interview, to the process of interviewing, which is an interaction typically either on the phone or over the web or face-to-face. When this person's been hired, you will review their performance, you will give them feedback. Based on that, you may decide to promote them. There will be numerous daily inter-office interactions, some trivial, some stress-filled, some crucial to the operating of the business. There will be group projects. There will be conflict resolutions, disciplinary actions, possibly firings and layoffs. We can predict that at every level, implicit biases should be influencing perceptions of others, the way that we construe them, the way that we understand their behavior, the characteristics we assign to them, the way that we make evaluations, and the way that we actually treat people from other groups will be influenced by these implicit biases. This will happen generally without our awareness, without our knowledge. It will be uncontrollable. All we get is the final product. All we get is this feeling that this person is lazy and does not fit in here, or this person does not respond to feedback well, and so should not be promoted. We will just have those final products. We won't understand that those products were influenced at every level by implicit bias. And to further complicate the issue, every individual belongs to hundreds of social categories. And for each of those categories, we may have an array of implicit biases. So for any given interaction or evaluation or perception, you can only guess at the calculations that are occurring in your brain that are going to combine and interact to influence these final mental products that you receive, and then how that eventually is carried on down the line to decisions. So I want to certainly talk about all these issues more in the interview phase of this webinar, but I wanted to end with how can you overcome implicit bias? And here we can end on a somewhat hopeful note. The photo I have here is just a mock-up photo of wiring within a brain, and that's one of the metaphors that I've been referring to, that your brain is like a computer. There are nodes and there are connections between the nodes that represent associations that you've learned, that you've been exposed to, that you perhaps have practiced in the case of a prejudiced individual. But it's wiring, and this wiring is especially likely to develop at a young age. And it becomes somewhat set in the adult years, but it remains malleable. You can rewire your brain at any stage of the lifespan. We talked about exposure as being the critical variable that influences the initial implicit biases that you acquire at a very young age. And at that level, when you're a 3 or 4 month old, you're exposed to whatever your parents point you at, or whatever conversations are occurring around you, commercials that are playing in the background. In your adult years, you have choices to make regarding exposure. You can choose to expose yourself to media, narratives, conversations that contain more positive pro-social associations, and try to avoid media that exposes you to stereotypical or prejudice-laden associations. You can try to interact with diverse people in positive settings where you're having direct, real-world evidence of positive associations. All of those things will continue to impact implicit biases, but hopefully in a more pro-social and positive way. Also, training can make a difference. We've talked about you can practice, if you're a prejudiced person, you can practice implicit bias and strengthen the biases that are already existing in your head. We can also practice diminishing these same implicit associations. One of the individuals responsible for Harvard's Project Implicit, Mahzarin Banaji, who still works at Harvard, when she developed this test, she was shocked and disappointed and saddened to learn that she had an implicit anti-Black racial bias. She considered herself to be very liberal, very progressive, and when she took her test the first few times, she thought it was a mistake, but she had a very strong pro-white bias. And again, as we talked about, that makes sense based on just the associations that exist within culture. What she did was she set up a screensaver that, as silly as this sounds, was pictures of Black faces and ice cream cones, a Black face and a balloon, just positive, happy things, and had this on in the background for hours a day while she was reading or working, just paying attention to it out of her peripheral vision. And over a few months, she actually diminished and eventually eradicated these negative implicit biases just by sort of force feeding her brain exposures to positive associations with respect to race. So there are apps that you can find. There are other places in the web that will offer this kind of exposure training to reduce or diminish negative implicit bias. Mindfulness is important. Mindfulness of the fact that implicit bias exists. You certainly have implicit bias in your head. Of course, you can go out and take tests to delve into the exact nature of your implicit bias. But being aware in any given situation that there is a potential, and I would say more than a potential, and almost certainly that your implicit biases are having an impact, are impacting your perceptions and your thoughts and your judgments. And particularly mindfulness when you're in situations where it really matters. When you're in a leadership position, where you're deciding who gets the job, who gets the raise, who are we going to lay off? And asking yourself, is it possible that implicit biases have infiltrated my decision-making, my evaluations without my awareness? Where does this gut impulse that I feel that this person is not an attractive candidate, where did that come from? And then reflecting upon, what can I do? Is there a way to come up with a more unbiased judgment? Is there a strategy where, say, I could try to remove all information regarding social categories from resumes so that I can try to make a more pure decision, apples to apples, without any possibility of implicit bias, because I don't even know the categories at this point. So that gives you some of the basics on implicit bias, what it is, where it comes from, how it might impact decision-making and thinking and behavior at all levels, and then what you can do about it. So I really encourage you to think about this, to be mindful of this on a daily, hourly, moment-by-moment basis as you're interacting with people, because we know there's a very consistent body of science on this. Implicit biases exist and they matter, and there's something we can do about it.
Wow, Bill, you have just given us a wealth of information. I've got a couple of pages of notes here and questions for you. But let's just start off with you telling us a bit about yourself. What kind of got you into this journey of wanting to explore bias and racism? Just what got you here?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I went to grad school at Ohio State University. I studied social psychology. And initially, I was just studying topics relating to persuasion, almost from the marketing point of view. And my advisor at the time, Tim Brock, who has since passed away, became fascinated with the topic of slave descendant reparations. And he was trying to understand why white Americans were so violently opposed to just the mere mention of reparations, let alone actually creating policy and paying out reparations in some form. So he asked me if I would be interested. This was not a topic I had ever thought about. I think as just a typical white person who grew up in a very sheltered white community, my initial thought was reparations, that slavery ended 150 years ago. No one alive today was a slave, and none of the whites today own slaves, so isn't this a non-starter? But then I started reading the literature about racial oppression and the Jim Crow era and prejudice throughout the 1900s and modern forms of prejudice and systematic racism, and it became very clear that the crime of slavery is still occurring in a different form, but it's still occurring, it's still disadvantaging minorities, and it's still damaging whites, and I was part of that. And so that just really changed my perspective on all of these topics. And so rather than going right into the job market, I took a postdoc at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, also at OSU, and really got into topics like racial colorblindness and systematic racism, and continued studying the topic of reparations, and then just decided that it's such a big problem, it's such an important problem, and a problem that we can't move forward as a nation until we start solving this problem, and that's all I wanted to do with my career. So that's what I applied to jobs for, talking about that kind of research. That's what I was going to come to university and do. I ended up in the OSU Mansfield, and there's a lot of good work to do. There's still a lot of ignorance, particularly among whites, regarding the nature of racial bias, and especially implicit racial bias, that where you have many white people saying, look, I'm fine. I am not aware that I have any bias whatsoever. I'm not a racist. And yet they are still acting within the system's systematic racism by virtue of implicit bias.
That's really a lot to unpack, because what strikes me as you talk about your journey a little bit is that no one really wants to feel guilty. And I think, though you didn't mention the word guilt per se, I think there's a little bit of that. No one wants to be responsible or feel guilty for, as I've heard many whites say, something that happened in the past. Mm-hmm. So through your current work, how is it that you help people to understand that, no, it's not just an issue of impact, but it's really more of an issue of continuing actions? How do you help people understand that?
Yeah, the nature of racial inequality and systematic racism is such that it's no longer individual racists who are perpetrating the system of oppression. It is, it's really always been written into the very fabric of society and our political institutions, capitalism. And so it's such a pervasive problem. We are all actors within this sort of play of systematic racism. We're all responsible in one way or another. And certainly, if you're in the play, you don't want to be the bad guy. You don't want to be the one who is advantaged by this system of inequality. I don't think anyone would like to say that they were. And certainly, no one wants to feel guilty either. People want to feel like, unless I have actively harmed someone, I have no responsibility. And I think more of the metaphor where if I am walking down the street and there's a hole in the ground and there's a person in the hole and they say, hey, your dad shoved me down into this hole, I would hope my default response would be, stop trying to make me feel guilty. I would hope I would reach my hand in and say, well, let's get you out of there. Even though I didn't do it, I'm connected to this in some way, and let's get you out of there. So there's that angle, but then there's also the angle that, and it relates to implicit bias. This bias exists. It's a part of our culture, and you can't snap your fingers and say, well, I'm better now, and I've done some work, and I've taken some exposure training courses, and I have rated myself as an implicit bias. That's great for you in your head at this moment, but we still have the issue of culture. And it is, I mean, it's a lifelong process of continuing in your own mind, in your own way individually to combat these associations and the systematic racism, but also trying to remove these structures from society and replace them with more equitable and just structures. And that's something that will be a process and a struggle that will last beyond my lifetime. It's continual. And we've seen progress made in the past that has vanished in times of stress or when economic downturn, or in times of war, when progress has been erased. So we can't just depend on the fact that things get better of their own accord, and we're on this continual upward trend of progress and equality.
I want to take just a few moments here to encourage our audience. If you have any questions, please be sure this is meant to be for you, to really help to allow you to apply this in the workplace or into yourself. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot those questions to us. But Phil, I want to go to something, I would want to return back to those issues of privilege and capitalism. But for right now, let's talk about how bias can actually start, or how soon it can start. Dr. Kang Lee of the University of Toronto, for example, has conducted some research that suggests that babies as young as 6 months old are capable of exhibiting signs of racial bias. How is that possible?
Yeah, so you can continue on with that sponge metaphor that when an infant is born and pops out into the world, outside of basic survival needs, they are to start acquiring associations and learn how to categorize the world and to make sense of the world. And they spend all their waking hours doing that. And what they have access to are cartoons and conversations and eventually media and advertisements. And there are just associations laden within all of those cultural structures. So one question is, why would this be occurring at such a young age? The brain is the brain, and at some level it's biological, and that is what brains do. They notice associations and they wire them. The associations that are noticed more commonly are wired more effectively in a more lasting and stronger way. Those become the dominant associations. Another question is, how do we know that a 6-month-old, or in some cases we've seen category differentiation in as young as 2 weeks old? How do we know that? There are really clever studies where one of the responses that you can record reliably in infants is staring. Infants stare at things that are new, different, that sort of pop up in their world. So you can present stimuli on a screen, and if it's new and interesting to an infant, they will stare, and they will stare a longer time. And then if you keep showing that same kind of stimuli, eventually they'll get bored and they'll look away. And that's something you can record. So if you show them a chair, it might interest them, another chair, they'll look a little less, another chair, eventually they get bored and look away. But then a ball shows up, there's something new, okay, I'm staring again. But if you keep showing balls, once again, I get bored and look away. So that really simple methodology can be used. I can show you a picture of a male face, and then a male face, and another male face. You're interested at first, you get less and less interested, and then you look away, but then a female face shows up. If an infant is differentiating between those categories in their mind, they will say, there's something different, I'm staring again. And that's how you will know, oh, they have that category in their head already. Similarly, if we're talking about prejudice and racial bias, I can show, say, something positive, something that makes the infant feel safe and happy. Safe and happy, safe and happy, and here's a blackface. What does the infant do? If there's no bias, this is just one more thing that has no particular association. If there's already a negative racial bias, ooh, here's something that's not like what I've been looking at. Here's a bad thing. And you can record the amount of staring and the sort of shock response. And that will be evidence, oh, there's a bias that we can record without having to ask them. And you can do that with any kind of category, any kind of bias. And so that's how they do those tests. And yeah, you do see it around 6 months, race, gender, age, facial attractiveness. You see positive biases that represent the general sort of in-group or cultural associations that they've been most commonly exposed to.
That's fascinating. How does that come into play? Say, for example, if a Caucasian family adopts a Black child who obviously looks different from what they look like, how does that kind of come into play then?
So it's what kinds of associations are you most commonly associated with? One of the findings that's somewhat tragic is that among young Black children, they will often have an implicit pro-white bias up until about the age of 6 because of just general cultural associations through the media, the commercials, even through school textbooks, which show whites making most of the contributions to society historically, and they get this picture that white equals good and Black equals bad. They even have, you can see, look up clips of this on YouTube, there's a girl named Curie Davis who did a high school project where she presented Black boys and girls with dolls that were either white or Black, and she would say, which one is the good one? And these Black children would pick up the white dolls. Which one is the smart one? The white doll. Which one is the nice one? The white doll. Which one looks like you? And they have to pick up the Black doll. And it's tragic, but it represents the exposure. Somewhere around 7 or 8, that usually flips as young Black children become more interested in their culture and are exposed to more positive associations. You start to see a more pro-Black bias emerge. For white children, on the other hand, everything is consistent. Both their family and everything they see in society is telling them they're good. They're picking up the doll that looks like them and saying, this is the nice one, the good one, the happy one, the safe one. So yeah, if you have a mixed race, mixed ethnicity family, it's just going to depend on the specific proportion of positive and negative associations that that child experiences both at home and in the world.
That's interesting. I'm gonna take this a different vein because now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the workplace. In an article by Mark Schwantz in Inc. magazine, he describes the phenomena of appearance discrimination. And he said there had been a lot of research done on that showed that young women who were workers in the workforce and millennials or younger in general typically were victims of this sort of appearance discrimination. I found that fascinating because I thought, then how do you add on top of that racial discrimination and its impact in the workplace?
That's what makes it complicated, is that, as I mentioned during the presentation, every individual belongs to hundreds, if not thousands, of social categories for which there exist common implicit biases. And again, related to it, particularly if your category is visible, if it's related to race or gender, if you're easily sort of typed. And appearance would be another one in terms of physical attractiveness, even things like height. We have implicit associations, say, between height and leadership, which is one of the reasons why generally the taller person running for the presidency has always been elected, because they elicit this feeling of, I want to follow. This is a dominant person who could be a leader. So yeah, if you have individuals who have that intersection of several categories for which there exist negative biases, there's not been a lot of research on this because it's hard to do, but there's no reason to expect that all of those biases wouldn't interact and sort of multiply with each other, such that you have some people who just walk in the door with 2 strikes against them already. Not by virtue of anything they've done, their personality, their characteristics, their abilities, but just the categories that are habitually assigned to them by others. So yeah, certainly appearance, race, gender, age, these are some of the big ones that are dominant in culture, that most people are going to have pretty strong implicit biases one way or the other about it.
Are there certain business categories that are more prone to biases, or at least especially explicit biases, than others? As you were talking, I was thinking, for example, about African American women, say, in the banking industry. And you know, the sense is that you probably need to have your hair flowing and pressed. Certainly not dreadlocks or braids, and certainly not wearing a dashiki underwear or something like that. Are there certain different business categories that are more, that you see those explicit biases more readily?
Yeah, I mean, I would answer that in two ways. One is that there are certain business contexts where the context itself elicits implicit associations regarding appearance, regarding gender, regarding race, regarding age, regarding dress, and so on. And if an individual in a given category clashes with those, that's something that generally creates a feeling of dis-ease and dislike in the mind that I was expecting this and now we have this and they're different. And I just don't like that inconsistency. So yeah, there are certain kinds of business contexts that I think where there are going to be those stronger associations. And certain individuals, again, just by virtue of the accident of birth, will fit those expectations more or less. Another way of answering that question is, implicit biases are especially influential when there are ambiguous situations or ambiguous judgments that you make. So in industries that are bottom line industries, maybe it's real estate, where I can say, regardless of what you think about me or my categories, I sold 28 homes this month. I sold a home a day, and no one else has even sold half that much. Can't argue with my numbers. Okay, so I will trust the numbers in that case, and I might have all these implicit associations that make me not trust this person, or I would evaluate them negatively, but there's these numbers. But then there are a lot of business contexts where success is more subjective, and where it's not clear exactly how successful this person is being. And in those situations, I think it's a very human tendency to consult implicit biases subconsciously to help you figure out, is this person succeeding? Are they failing? Do they have potential? Would they make a good leader? So in those kinds of business contexts, and that might be different jobs within the same business, one that's more stats, bottom line oriented, and one that's more subjective, the implicit biases are probably going to be more harmful when you have the subjective kinds of job positions.
Along those lines, in terms of talking about leadership, you mentioned that in one of the assessments, the Harvard assessment tool, for example, just recently they added presidential sorts of biases. And I found that interesting because you said that sometimes someone who's taller will more favorably bias than someone who's shorter. Tell us, what are some of the positive associations? Because as we look at this, this season, this election season, particularly on the Democratic side, the numbers of candidates that we have are pretty broad. And, we have a few women in there, African-American woman, there's age, the issues of age have come up with Biden. Tell us a little bit about, just from a visceral point of view, what do we expect or look for when it comes to a leader? How could, because like many people, for example, use Barack Obama as the example that I am not biased, because guess what? I voted for him. So tell me, how does all of that mix together when we're talking about leadership on a national level?
Yeah, I mean, especially on the national level, I think we associate leadership with traits like competence and dominance and intelligence. These are traits that, again, throughout culture and history have tended to be gender coded, somewhat associated with age. And so typically the default, I think, category that you associate with leadership would be an older white male. And in fact, that's what you see. So if you were trying to evaluate candidates, someone like Joe Biden has a built-in advantage because he looks like what we expect. He looks like the qualities we associate with leadership. So you can think about it from that angle, and from the other angle, it's exposure again. So when I think about who have the presidents been, it's older white males. And that has built an association. So you get these dual associations that all end at Joe Biden at the implicit level. And that's going to be a built-in advantage that he has. Now, hopefully, if you're making a decision as important as who am I going to vote for president, you've done a lot more thinking about it. You've consulted, policy stances and platforms, and you've listened to debates. So you have a lot more information, and it's very deliberative. And that's where implicit biases become less and less impactful the more and more thinking you do. But even at that level, my interpretation of, say, Joe Biden's healthcare plan, as opposed to Elizabeth Warren's healthcare plan, might be subtly biased by gender in ways that I don't know, that I'm not aware of. And then I might consciously say, oh, see, here's why I'm voting for Joe Biden, because I think he has the better plan, not knowing why you think that. So at that level, and I would say that would apply if you're talking about high level, CEO level roles in any organization, when you're looking for the just stereotypical leadership traits of competence, dominance, intelligence, and so on. Yeah, you're going to have certain categories that seem to align better with those traits. And again, explicitly, we might say, I hope I don't feel that way. I hope I don't make decisions that way. And that's great. I mean, I hope you feel that way. But it's important to remember that implicitly you may, and that might influence your judgments in a million subtle ways. And again, just leave you with the final product of I'm voting for that one and not that one, not knowing how you've been biased along the way.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I think about is, for example, I call her our sister country, England, Great Britain. They had the Iron Maiden, Margaret Thatcher, as a leader for so many years. Is it possible that biases are kind of nationally kind of focused too, like certain biases are more prevalent in American culture versus British culture, even though they're both more of a Eurocentric approach?
Yeah, I mean, the specific culture will make a difference. And even within the US, there's lots of subcultures, regionally, certainly politically, in terms of ideologies that are their own cultures. And say within an ideology culture, let's say Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, you will be selectively exposed through Facebook and Instagram and through the news channel you watch and through the magazines you read to one culture or the other. So you will be exposed to very different sets of associations that may predispose you to, in some cases, a female candidate or a minority candidate, just because of the sheer level of exposure you have that's positive in that realm towards those categories. Related to your specific example, one thing that you do occasionally see is a strong female leader who is elected, does a job well, and then in some really ironic twist, is judged negatively because she's acting too much like a man. She's no longer a good woman if she's displaying characteristics we associate with a man. And you don't just see this in politics, you see this within the business world, where on the one hand, females tend not to be promoted to leadership positions because of the implicit assumptions that they will not thrive. But then when they are, and they do thrive, they get evaluated negatively because of those qualities that allow them to thrive. So it is complicated, and that's where mindfulness and reflection, what are we doing? Is that the culture we want to exist within? Do we want to change that culture? It's really important to ask those questions of society and of ourselves as well.
You know, the incident of Charlottesville really rocked our country and our conscience, I think, as a nation and as a people. And this seemed to be a real key moment for leadership to step up. Many suggest that our president at the time did not step up in a way that really demonstrated strong leadership. My question, I bring that up to say this, how do our implicit biases actually impact our ability to make key leadership decisions?
Well, implicit biases are generally going to connect to our values, and most of our decisions are value driven to some extent. So you're going to, in that instance, if you're trying to figure out who was to blame here, who needs to do some self-reflection, where are we pointing the fingers, clearly values are going to influence how you make those decisions. And again, it could be consciously, it could be implicitly and subconsciously, maybe at both of those levels, they may converge in some instances. So there's that angle on it. I also do want to take this opportunity to say that I have talked in general about exposure being important, just being exposed to associations, but not all exposure is equivalent. So we are especially influenced by exposure from similar others, from our in-group members, because one of our jobs is to fit into our specific subculture, to learn the associations that are common within and among our own subculture. So that happens at a sort of microscopic level with our families and our friends and our communities and our churches and so on. But also at the national level, the associations that are presented by leaders, high-level leaders like presidents, have a huge impact, a much greater impact than those same kinds of sentiments and associations being presented by just someone in the supermarket that you overview. And that's one of the reasons why those positions carry with them such incredible responsibility for presenting pro-social, positive, beneficial associations to the nation. That's one of the reasons I think, in my mind, that Charlottesville was such a big deal, those sentiments, because it sent a message to everyone that intolerance will be tolerated, that we will try to understand the intolerance and not be too harsh. And that's really acts as a trigger for people who are already of that mindset or who were maybe right on the fence and could have been sort of shifted one way or the other. So I don't know if I got to your exact initial question, but I did want to make that point that leaders have a great responsibility because they're especially influential when it comes to exposing people to these associations.
Well, actually, you just triggered another question in my thought process here, because on one level, you could say that a leader is a victim of his or her own environment. You know, when you talk about their in-groups, and if you've been in a place of privilege where you've never been exposed to anything other than your peers, your colleagues in a certain realm, it makes you probably insensitive, if you will, to those from other backgrounds. And what kind of came to mind was Robert Kennedy, for example. Senator Robert Kennedy in the 60s. I think for those who follow history, there was a marked difference between Robert Kennedy prior to his brother's assassination than Robert Kennedy afterwards, the Robert Kennedy that went to Appalachia, for example, to see how those individuals lived, or who went to what was termed in the ghettos of Detroit, New York, to understand more fully what poverty looked like. And he was amazed, he said, to see that Americans, regardless of what color, were struggling to eat, for example. So I think you make a really compelling point when you talk about the importance of exposure, particularly as it relates to leadership. So much so that when he was able, upon the assassination of Martin Luther King, he actually announced that assassination. I believe it was in Indianapolis. And the empathy with which he was able to convey, you know, a great leader has been assassinated this evening, and you may be tempted as Black Americans to be angry at all whites, but just remember, I understand that feeling because my brother was killed by a white. And I just felt like that was powerful. And you don't hear that kind of leadership anymore where somebody says, you know, I walked that, maybe differently, but I still experience some of your anguish. So that wasn't a question, obviously, but I just wanted to share that because that your commentary really triggered that. Tell us how these biases, again, like in terms of the workplace though, unpack that a little bit more for us, because how do you differentiate between, okay, here's my real bias that I really have to address versus that individual that kind of drums up almost false guilt, if you will, and says, well, you know, I know I'm privileged and feels guilty at every turn. How do you balance that in the workplace?
Yeah,
Especially if you're a leader.
yeah, it's a great point. You will never know. For a given evaluation and judgment, a thought you had about someone, you will never know what percentage or proportion of that judgment, let's say, is based on real evidence and criteria and is fair and just, and which percentage is based on, say, implicit bias. That is why, I mean, I ended the presentation by saying reflection and mindfulness. You really need to question yourself and to think about your thinking and ask those questions. Is it possible that I have been biased? If I have been biased, what's the likely direction of the bias based on cultural associations, based on tests I've taken, where I know where my bias lies? If I need to correct this judgment, in what direction should I correct? What kind of correction should I make? And you may, in certain cases, sincerely believe, no, I've been over this resume 1,000 times. I could be biased here, but I really think this person would not be a good fit. I'm not going to hire them. Or we have to hand out promotions, and I'm just giving up percentages, and I really think this person deserves the most, and that person deserves the least. And I know that's consistent with the bias, but I'm looking at numbers here, performance, and I don't think I'm being biased. But in some cases, it won't be that clear. In some cases, you will realize, I don't know why, but I'm not excited about this resume. Even though everything I see on here looks great, I'm feeling like I have to talk myself into this person. This might be a bias cropping up. And maybe I should give this person the benefit of the doubt and give them an interview just in case I was being biased. So it's, I guess if you used the principle of do no harm, I'm aware that I have biases. I'm never aware if they're operating or what the extent of that operation has been. But I'm going to be correcting in the direction of being beneficent and doing less harm, and make that mistake, that I've been maybe too kind or too lenient with someone as opposed to being unfair or not giving someone an opportunity because of a bias. So yeah, it's not a science. I would say it's more of an art, but it is something that you can be mindful. You can do the work of reflecting and questioning yourself. And once again, not to plug for these tests, Harvard's Project Implicit, if you take the test, you'll at least know that there's a potential in your head that a bias exists with respect to one or more categories.
It sounds like these tests at least beg the question for the taker, that possibly this could be an area of vulnerability in my thinking, in my approach. I want to look at bias from the vantage point of the person who might be the recipient of some explicit biases or implicit, but more explicit, and they feel as though that maybe there's an appearance discrimination, for example, going on because they have braids and they try to solicit the support in the regard of their supervisor, and it just seems to just fall short. It feels as though it falls flat. How does an individual who feels as though she is encountering explicit bias, how does she articulate that in such a way that she doesn't sound like she's just playing the race card or the female card, or just being a victim? How does she present her case that I think there's a problem here, and I've tried to share this, but it seems to be a dead-end street for me?
Yeah, so there's two answers I would give to that. One is, and this is not a fair answer, but it shouldn't be up to the individuals who are the targets of implicit bias to solve this problem. There should be an awareness among and within organizations, and procedures should be instituted to try to reduce biases, to create more objectivity, more tolerance, more equality. So that's my social justice answer. But once again, the tricky thing about this is if you're an individual who feels that they have been disadvantaged by implicit bias, rarely will there be any smoking gun to point at. Generally, this is going to be subtle, And generally, this is going to be conveyed on an individual by decision basis. So I think one thing you can do is to look for the pattern, is to find people who may be in the same boat as you and say, here are some experiences I've had, here are some feelings. Wow, none of us have been promoted in the last 5 years, and we've seen other people of similar capabilities being promoted. This seems pretty consistent with an implicit bias. And it seems like we can marshal enough sort of circumstantial evidence to, press a claim to the leadership and say, can we have a conversation about this? I think that's part of it. And then the other part is education, trying to expose people in leadership positions to this kind of information, these topics, and make them aware of the potential for bias, to encourage them to question themselves to the extent that you can do that as someone who's an employee or in a subordinate position within an organization. But it's tricky because it's never going to be so clear cut that maybe your lack of a promotion was due to implicit bias as opposed to sheer performance or what the proportions were. So it's hard to give a really clear recipe for success in those situations or a plan for action.
Absolutely. But speaking of education, one of the things that those in this field who really try to combat bias and racism and provide training in the workplace, what sorts of training is really going to be most impactful? A lot of businesses feel that, according to Harvard Business Review, that trainings really kind of fall short. They're great for a kumbaya experience in the more immediate sense, that as you're listening to the training and you're getting an awareness, it's like, wow, I guess that makes sense. But the longevity of that impact is considered to be pretty short, because a week later, 2 weeks later, there are those subtle things that come right back into play. How do you provide, what sorts of elements within training really make diversity training or bias training, most meaningful, most impactful?
Yeah, I think you could use almost a medical model here and maybe equate it with a disease like diabetes, where it's not going to be a one-time treatment. It's going to be a lifetime course of treatment, and it's not going to be a pill or an injection. It's holistic. It involves medicine, it involves lifestyle changes, but that are going to need to be continual throughout the lifespan. So yeah, a one-time workshop, a one-time a book that everyone reads in an office about diversity might have an impact temporarily, but then the moment you walk out of that workshop, here's culture again, with all of those same associations and systems of inequality that you're confronted with, that will begin working on your brain again and reestablishing those same old biases, and you start to fall in the same old patterns. So it really needs to be a commitment to a different mindset, to a different kind of exposure in terms of associations and people and diversity, that is not, again, just like a one-time treatment or inoculation, but it's a different way of doing business, of being a leader, of living your life and thinking about people, and something, a skill that you practice and that you continue to hone throughout a lifespan. Because yeah, it is within my lifespan, I'm sure we're going to continue to confront these issues of implicit bias and systematic inequality. And so, yeah, it's a lifetime process, I would say. And that's something that can become part of the culture of a business or an organization, where diversity is not just one of the initiatives, it is a principle or a value that's connected to all parts of the business, all interactions, customer relations, employee relations, at every level. There's an awareness, and there are safeguards for especially people in categories where there are stigmas or where there are stereotypes and prejudice. So it's not an easy one-time thing. It's a big commitment, but I think it's certainly worthwhile.
Yeah, it definitely seems to me to be something that's an ongoing kind of effort, that you can never sit on your laurels and think I've arrived, but rather you just continue using your metaphor toward the path of social wellness, if you will.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you might decide, okay, I think I have a handle on race now. Okay, what about gender? What about disability? What about sexual orientation? What about personality styles, introversion, extroversion? There are so many different kinds of people in the world and different traits and tendencies and characteristics. And you're going to need to engage in that same kind of process for each of those categories, to some extent separately. So yeah, there's always good work to be done in your own head and in your organization regarding this topic.
And you just kind of hit on something that I was going to ask. Why do you think it is that there are certain categories or classes, if you will, that just always seem to rise to the top in terms of our need for focus or attention? You know, you mentioned like race, like gender, and gender preference, economics. Why do you think that there are these seem to take more precedent or more attention, if you will, than say someone who's an introvert versus an extrovert?
Yeah, I mean, when it's a visible category, there's going to be more potential for stigmatization and for biased associations. But I mean, if you're just talking about this country, this country was founded based upon a system of racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality. It's written into the documents. It's written into the institutions, and so these institutions have been changed somewhat over the past couple hundred years, but not as much as people think. So these inequalities will continue to crop up and be maintained from year to year, generation to generation, because that's what the machine produces. It produces inequality. Not to sound too revolutionary, but you do come back to some of those dominant categories because there's such a pervasive history of inequality in these systems and institutions have such just the force of time behind them and are so pervasive that they almost become invisible, especially if you're the beneficiary, if you're the person who's advantaged by all these systems. And it's not just advantage in terms of economics, jobs, and geography and things like that. It's also tied into self-esteem. Being able to think for hundreds of years in this country, I'm the good one. I'm the one who this country is for. When we say make America great again, we're talking about make it great for me again. That's quite a privilege. That's tied right into your self-esteem. And so one of the sources of resistance you'll find, say, particularly among white males, is if you're asking me to give up these implicit biases, there's a portion of my self-esteem that I am going to have to reject. And there's going to be a bit of a sting to that, and that's going to leave a bit of a vacuum. And what do I do with that vacuum? So that's going to be a source of resistance, and we're talking about race in this case, or gender in this case, but everyone belongs to certain categories that are privileged. Whether it's not having a disability, or being able to read, or having money in a bank account, or whatever it is, we all exist in some cases a more privileged part of the dimension. And to ask people to give that up, and you know what you're losing. And we're asking you to give that up for lack of a better word, to tend to your soul and to have a world where you live with justice and equality as opposed to these unfair privileges. There's a really abstract answer to that question.
It was a bit abstract and it was revolutionary. I think that's a good segue to my last question. And I'm thinking of a book by John Meacham in which he talked about the soul of America and how America has been confronted before with this question of, are people really to be treated equitably? What do we do with this hierarchy in our culture in which a certain group of people benefit and others don't? last question is this, and you kind of touched on it, but I want you to elaborate. Why is it, and maybe this is where self-interest comes into play, so maybe I'm going to answer this before you do. But why is it that we're so resistant to letting go of our biases and our isms, even when confronted with the truth? You know, I find it interesting in today's kind of rhetoric. We hear a lot about, you know, fake news, and after a while you kind of feel like, well, what is truth and what value does it have if it doesn't change something? So can you just share with us? It's a great way to kind of segue our close, is to just kind of help us to understand, why are people resistant to that? And if they're going to be resistant, then kind of what's the point? So it's a twofold question.
Yeah, so I have a bunch of different answers for that question. Why is there resistance? One, I mentioned a lot of our biases service around self-esteem. And self-esteem is a kind of vitamin that we all crave. And when it's taken away from us, we get upset, and we get threatened, and we get sad, and we get angry. And so, yeah, in many cases, when you ask someone to confront their biases, you're asking them to put their own self-esteem on the line, their own integrity on the line. There's that. Secondly, all of these implicit associations were designed to help you understand the world, to let you know what to expect, to let you know how to behave. So there's a familiarity and a safety there. And you're asking people to forego that familiarity, to forego that safety. Every interaction you have with someone, I want you to treat it as a completely new experience. You're not going to come in with any pre-made expectations that will make life easier for you. You're not allowed to assume anything about this person. And that's a frightening position to be in. It's uncomfortable to feel as if I have no bearings here within this interaction. At least my implicit biases give me some basic expectations. Even if they're unfair, I feel somewhat more safe and more comfortable. So you're asking people to, I guess, be a bit courageous, and some of these default coping mechanisms that we employ to deal with the sheer complexity of the world, to forego those, to actually treat people as unique individuals. So there's two reasons. A third reason is just the nature of implicit bias. You say when you're confronted with the truth, but the truth is usually subjective, and implicit biases influence what we see in the world in a way that's consistent with those biases. So two people can look at the same quote unquote truth and see totally different things based on their implicit biases. So a lot of the times the evidence that we think we see in the world resembles our implicit biases. And it makes sense to us, and then of course the end result is it strengthens our implicit biases, which just ramps up the process for the next time around. That's just a basic cognitive tendency, and that's where mindfulness and reflectiveness comes in, to overcome that tendency to just mindlessly evaluate or judge others. But the first two, the self-esteem, I'm sorry, but if you're a human being, you need to do better than just feeling self-satisfied all the time. You're here to perpetuate justice and equality, even at the expense of your ego occasionally. And in terms of the familiarity and the safety associated with implicit bias, we're alive. You need to take some chances and take some risks when it concerns justice and equality, and put yourself out there, expose yourself to unfamiliar people and cultures and situations. In my mind, that's what you're here to do. I don't think anyone gets points for being overly safe in their approach to humanity.
Well, thank you so much. What a way to end it.
Sorry, a little preachy there.
You did, you were a bit preachy, but I appreciate that, because it really kind of brings us to full circle to consider what's important to us, both individually as well as collectively, because we don't live as an island unto ourselves. We do interact with others on a daily basis. So Bill, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. Thank you so much. Thank you to our listening audience. We appreciate your support and just your participation, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.